Well, Lindsay, Leanne, Jill, Mr Mayor, cyfeillion, diolch yn fawr iawn am croeso. Dylwn ni egluro ar y dechrau mod i yn mynd i draddodi'r ddarlith hon yn bennaf yn Saesneg, a fyddai wrth gwrs yn fodlon iawn ateb cwestiynau ym mha bynnag iaith ar ddiwedd y cyfarfod. It's a great pleasure to be back here in Merthyr in this building, where I took my first elected role as a Plaid Cymru's only councillor on the old Merthyr Tydfil County Borough Council in May 1972. And it was a salutary experience. I still have the scars to show for it. But neither did the ruling Labour group escape without a few bruises. And in 1976, of course, Plaid took control of the council under the leadership of Emrys Roberts. We won't talk about 1979 and thereafter, but those were indeed heady days. Eleanor here, who is also delighted to be back, was elected to the new Merthyr Council in 1973. And in one way, I was sorry that she and I left Merthyr in 1974 to return to Carnarvon, where, as you say, I'd been elected MP, 40 years ago this spring. I left my job as financial controller of Hoover, having just persuaded the company to invest what would, in today's money, be as much as £174 million on an expansion scheme to gain more of the European washing machine market as a direct result of Britain joining, as it was then, the European Economic Community in 1973. That scheme would have brought 3,000 new jobs to this valley, and I left before the project was concluded, and I was sorry about that. But you know, leaving Mars Limited in Slough to join Hoover in Merthyr meant moving from the banks of the Thames to the banks of the Taff. I remember asking Harold Green, a Cockney estate agent in Cardiff, what houses he had on sale in Merthyr. Where are you living now? He asked. I responded, Maidenhead. Maidenhead? Maidenhead to Merthyr, he said. You must be bleeding mad, he said. Now then I told him that beauty was in the eye of the beholder, and that I was certain that there would be more of a community spirit in Merthyr, and there was. At the end of my first day at Hoover's, I called at a newsagent's up the high street here, asking for a South Wales Echo. And the man behind the counter picked up a copy, folded it, but before handing it over to me, he looked at me carefully and said, "Who are you then?" They didn't ask that sort of question in Maidenhead those days. I gave him my name. "Oh, what are you doing here then?" he said, still clutching the Echo. "I'm working in Hoover," I said. "Hoover's?" he pondered. "What are you doing there then?" I didn't like to say I was head of finance in case he thought I was some sort of industrial tycoon or something, so I just said, "I'm on the administrative side." Nobody told me, he said. Passed over the paper and concluded our get-to-know-you interview. No doubt there is still that sense of community here in Merthyr. We had many, many friends, some of whom have now sadly passed away. And I'd like to put on record my fond memories of 3 who have died fairly recently. Marian Morris, Gwyn Griffiths and Anne Williams. Plaid Cymru was certainly indebted to all 3 for their committed support. One person who will remember my days in the council chamber in this building is, of course, the retiring Mayor of Merthyr, Councillor Graham Davies, who I'm delighted to see here and marry. Here, of course, in a civic capacity, not a political capacity. We can't read anything like that into it, and we won't do so. Graham was then the planning officer of the old county borough, and Mary and Graham were great friends of ours across the political divide down the years. Graham will perhaps recall the occasion when I tore up my order paper and stormed out of the council here on account of the dragging of feet with the Welsh language education. And Graham and Mary played a major role in securing the first Welsh school, as it was known. And indeed, Graham himself, by then a mid-Glamorgan county councillor, if I recollect correctly, lost the Labour whip for a period of time for standing up for Welsh medium education. We should all remember that while there are times when inevitably we have to pull out each other's eyes, particularly at election time, there are also issues of common cause when we have to stand together, whether it's for Wales, for social justice, or for peace. And just as Graham made his own stand against his own party, so at almost the same time, I found myself having to make a similar stand against my own party, my own beloved Plaid. And that was on the issue that was absolutely central to my political vision, namely the overarching importance of European unity as the context within which a self-governing Wales makes sense. So I'm delighted to be here tonight to address issues concerning the links between Wales and Europe at a time when there's so much uncertainty about the relationship between Britain and Europe. As I approach the end of my political career, Europe again dominates the political agenda, just as it did in 1975, in my first year as MP, when the referendum was held to confirm Britain's membership of the common market. So now is a good time to recall the historic importance of Europe to Wales, its place in Plaid Cymru's politics, and to remind ourselves and to tell the younger generation about the struggles Plaid has led to get the best possible deal for Wales from Europe, to review our current links with the EU, and how Wales's relationship with Europe will shape Plaid Cymru's future constitutional ambitions. And I address these for three reasons. Firstly, we have the European elections in 2 weeks' time, and I'm delighted that Jill Evans is standing for re-election to that Parliament, where she has served Wales with so much distinction over 15 years. I'm also glad to see Johan Bellin here. I'm not sure if any other candidates are here. I haven't caught up with everybody in the audience yet, but I'm certain that everyone here would agree that Wales's voice would be seriously diminished if Jill were not in the European Parliament and able to use her mandate from Wales to give the needs of Wales primacy on all occasions. Secondly, we're in the run-up to Scotland's independence referendum on the 18th of September. When a major issue for Scotland will be the membership of the European Union. And the central question is whether Scotland can enjoy continuity of membership during a transition to independence, which my old friend, First Minister Alex Salmond, has proposed should be on the 24th of March 2016. Thirdly, we've seen in recent years a backlash against the EU. We've seen the emergence of UKIP, who want a referendum to pull Britain out of the EU, with very serious implications indeed for Wales. So why was I so attached to a united Europe, enough to place it on an equal footing, in my mind, to securing Wales's national freedom? Primarily, it was to do with the political structures to safeguard peace in Europe. Because during the first half of the 20th century, when I was born, Europe had been ravaged by two bloody wars. The first was a pointless bloodletting between imperial powers. Millions got slaughtered, heroes led by donkeys. The second war grew out of the stupidity of the first. The 1939 war, more justifiable given the evils of fascism, if war can ever be justified, was another awful tragedy. But it led people to seek a new framework in Europe, so that never again would we see our continent torn apart. Many of our fellow Europeans suffered war in a much more direct, personal fashion than we did in these islands, with occupation armies moving backwards and forwards through their own communities. It was natural that at the end of the Second War, for them to seek new political structures to ensure that never again would this be allowed to happen. They had learnt the lesson of the League of Nations. They knew it wasn't enough to have well-meaning people around a table. Yes, by all means, create forums to maintain dialogue. But more than this was needed, much more. They asked themselves, what are the essential tools of war? And concluded that without independent ownership of two basic commodities, coal and steel, no country could go to war. So it was, by the Treaty of Paris 1951, France, Germany, Italy, Belgium, the Netherlands and Luxembourg pooled their coal and steel industries. And that, at a stroke, would undermine their capacity of going to war against each other. In the words of Robert Schuman, the French foreign minister who proposed the treaty, it would make war between France and Germany not only unthinkable, but materially impossible. That was their starting point, but it wasn't their ultimate goal. They wanted more fundamentally to change the attitudes that cause war. They saw the need to create democratic structures which would bring Europe closer together. And this led to the Treaty of Rome in 1957, establishing a common market between those 6 countries, with a free movement of people, goods and money between them, so that their borders would become redundant in economic terms. Increased mutual trade would make their economies interdependent, creating another impediment to war. Secondly, I saw the importance of European unity as the essential framework for Wales in the second half of the 20th century. I start from the premise that Wales is a European nation. In language and culture, folklore and traditions, Wales's roots are in Europe. And perhaps most significantly, Wales's Christian values came from Europe, the basis of Christian socialism, which, more than Karl Marx, has been the bedrock of our egalitarian and community-based values, and the foundation of our civilization. As Gwynfor never tired in reminding us, and Dafydd has never retired from singing about, Wales emerged as an identifiable community, an embryonic nation after the departure of the Romans. Wales was moulded under their influence, and we shouldn't hesitate in answering the Monty Python question which you quoted a moment ago, Lindsay. What did the Romans ever do for us? They made us a nation. Plaid Cymru's European credentials have never been in doubt, even during the 1970s when the party opposed the common market. It did so not because it was European or because it meant pooling sovereignty, but because it was too commercially driven, too centralist, that Wales wasn't recognised in its own right, and neither was our language. Plaid Cymru came into existence in the aftermath of the First War, portrayed in Wales as a war fought to protect the freedom of little nations. The peace settlement of Versailles recognised Austria, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Poland, Bulgaria, Romania, and redefined the borders of Belgium and Holland. And many thought that this would also spawn a new attitude towards the 3 Celtic nations. The Speakers' Conference of 1919, which some had hoped would lead to Home Rule all round, never took off. So when Plaid Cymru was formed in 1925, it was against the background of a tragic European war, a Liberal Party which failed to deliver on Home Rule, an emerging Labour Party more attracted to Marxism in Russia than fulfilling Arthur Henderson's pledges to Wales. Plaid Cymru's attitude to Europe was firmly declared in the first page of the first lecture by the party's first leader, Saunders Lewis, to the party's first ever summer school in 1926. He said, and I quote, "Let us glance at the history of Wales. It's a country that was once part of the Roman Empire, that inherited the Latin civilization of Europe, and after the fall of Rome, sought to build its life on the basis of that tradition." And he continued, "In medieval Europe, no one country was free or independent, or claimed that its government, within its own boundaries, was the supreme and only authority. Every nation and every king recognized there was an authority higher than state authority. That authority was the moral authority. And for a while, Europe was one. And Europe's oneness in that age, its oneness in moral principle and under one law, protected the culture of every land and region. One of the profoundest ideas of the Middle Ages, Saunders Lewis said, was an idea Christianity inherited from the Greeks. It was the idea that unity contains variety. There was one law and one civilization throughout Europe, but that law, that civilization, took on many forms and many colours. That, my friends, the Europe of many forms and many colours, is the Europe towards which we aspire today. Saunders Lewis rejected the term independence, placing his emphasis on national freedom, as indeed did Gwynfor Evans. This was the basis that every country is interdependent, and I agree that this is technically more accurate. Now, I'm not going to reopen tonight semantic issues about words like that. Suffice it to say that Plaid Cymru adopted independence as its objective a decade ago because the European Union itself had stipulated that membership of the EU was only open to independent states. Now, I most certainly want Wales to be a member of the EU in its own right. That's what drives my politics. So if, for that purpose, we have to declare we are independent, so be it. The first thing we'll do as a member state of the EU, of course, is to surrender part of that independence in order to build a united Europe, in which every nation accepts the need to yield some of its sovereignty. That's the basis of the Treaty of Rome. And I well remember in 1957 the signing of that treaty. I bought a copy of it. I had little idea as to the meaning of the words, but they seemed to incorporate a vision which instinctively appealed to me. And at about this time, I came across the works of Leopold Kohr and Schumacher, which portrayed the idea that small nations and historic regions have their place in the sun. It seemed to me that building our common European homeland, a continent of 100 flags, made every good sense in the 20th century world. Power and decision-making should be exercised at the most local level feasible. And that's a European principle. And I later learned that it's called subsidiarity. Now, I pondered how a free Wales could avoid being an inward-looking, isolationist Wales, something which I felt I just couldn't identify with. There were some who advocated this for Wales, but they didn't include Gwynfor Evans. He realised that it was a nonsense to suggest that the future Wales should have customs posts at Saltney and Chepstow, and that mid-Wales farmers should show passports every time they went to Oswestry Market. It's so easy for Plaid Cymru's political enemies to label such notions as separatist, because that's exactly what they conveyed: separatism. Separatism from our neighbours, and indeed separatism from reality. The Wales for which Gwynfor worked was a Wales which should aspire to be something much greater, to be part of a wider international community. And I know Jill, concur. We have a contribution to make to the world, and we have a duty to make it. In 1960, Gwynfor Evans wrote a pamphlet entitled Self-Government for Wales and a Common Market for the Nations of Britain. And in this, Gwynfor accepted the reality that autonomy for Wales would have to be within the structure of free movement of people, goods and capital between the countries of Britain. This was, for me, the essential oil that made the wheels of Plaid Cymru move forward in a coherent manner. And these are, after all, the principles on which the SNP campaigns today, rejecting an isolationist interpretation of independence, recognising the reality of a social union within which we live in these islands, the economic market whereby we buy and sell our products one from another, and the currency implications which are central to any customs union or common market. It's an uncanny anticipation of arguments now relating to Scotland's independence referendum that this pamphlet 60 years ago, in the context of self-government, called for three things. Firstly, a common market between the three countries of Britain, with a total free movement of people, goods and capital between the countries. Secondly, a common currency between the three countries. And thirdly, a common citizenship, enabling open borders and a free movement of people without passport control. To facilitate the workings of such a common market, there would be joint standing conferences of the three economic ministers, a joint exchequer board to deal with the equitable distribution of any taxes collected conjointly, and the continued use of the pound sterling with representation from Wales and Scotland on the Bank of England's governing bodies. Now then, in parallel with the common market on the European mainland, Gwynfor argued there could be similar structures between the countries of Britain. And that's why I found it so strange in the late 1960s, when serious debate grew about Britain joining the common market, that Plaid Cymru distanced itself. It seemed to me that if there was to be an open trade relationship between the countries of Europe, that surely should require regulation to stop the exploitation of communities and of working people, and to ensure fairness within markets and between countries. I know that many people on the Conservative right welcome the common market as an opportunity to maximise profits. But progressive political leaders on the continent always saw the need for the common market to have a social dimension that safeguarded those open to exploitation. That was where the great divide grew within Plaid Cymru in the early 70s. A majority in the party saw the common market as a threat. It was a valid fear, but I felt that there were other solutions by providing social safeguards. So in 1975, I was one of 3 Plaid Cymru MPs in a party that opposed Britain's membership of the common market. I respected the party's view, but I thought it was wrong. I limited myself to holding meetings in my own constituency where I could explain the party's reasons for supporting a no vote and then explain my reasons for calling for a yes vote. And as we know, Wales voted yes in that referendum by 65% to 35%. And it was a great relief for me in the late 1980s, Plaid Cymru reconsidered its position, accepting the reality that we were in the European Economic Community and therefore we should work to ensure the best deal for Wales within Europe rather than arguing about withdrawal. Now let me make it clear. Accepting that Wales should be part of the European Union doesn't mean that Plaid Cymru or any of us regards everything in the EU as perfect. On the contrary, Plaid's view was, and is, that Wales should strive to improve the way Europe is governed, to minimise bureaucratic waste, and to strengthen democratic answerability, to ensure that the principle of subsidiarity is central to European thinking, and that Wales should have its own voice within the decision-making mechanisms of Europe, that European institutions should respect the cultural diversity of our continent and should sustain human rights, environmentally sustainable policies, political plurality, the commitment to peace and a responsibility towards a third world. This is the Europe that Plaid Cymru always wanted, and I believe the Europe within which the people of Wales can be comfortable. And this is the vision of Europe towards which Jill Evans has consistently and passionately worked. Jill has campaigned to end the wasteful practice of the European Parliament travelling from Brussels to Strasbourg every month, to scrap the costly House of Europe Museum project, and to focus the European Parliament's work more effectively on its lawmaking functions rather than spawning opinions of little direct value. Jill has worked to make the European institutions more efficient, more transparent, more democratic, exactly the sort of changes that the people of Wales want. And I want to pay tribute to Jill for her consistent advocacy of non-racial civic nationalism, which is central to Plaid Cymru's vision. I am proud that this party in this election emphasised at our manifesto launch that we are eager to attract the best talents from anywhere around the world, whatever their race, colour or creed, to live and work in Wales. That has been our long-standing commitment. It was even emphasised in our economic plan for Wales in 1970. Plaid Cymru is an outward-looking, anti-racial party. And given the comments of some parties in this election, let me repeat our commitment to drive racism in all its ugly forms into the dustbin of history. Jill has also worked hard to establish a group of like-minded MEPs from small countries such as Scotland, Flanders, the Basque Country and Corsica, nations submerged, like Wales, in a larger multinational state. They have worked to achieve a decentralist, democratic and progressive Europe, for which we all yearn, and the European Free Alliance of such small parties is a significant group within today's European Parliament. I had many opportunities to cooperate with such individuals and parties over the years. People like the late Jan Fuere of Brittany, who worked to establish such a Europe. And we have often wanted a somewhat different model to the one which existed, but we recognised the need to work with the grain of Europe to achieve such change. And over the years, much change has indeed been achieved. The European Union, of the 28 countries as currently formulated, is a very different union to that of the 6 countries that came together in 1957. It's a different union from the 9 countries which Britain entered in 1973. The Europe today has amongst its members 11 countries who are beyond the Iron Curtain which separated East and West. Poland, the Czech Republic, Slovakia, Bulgaria, Romania, Hungary, Slovenia, Croatia, Estonia, Latvia and Lithuania. And they, together with the old East Germany, are now fully part of the European Union. The first fact that many Eurosceptics choose to forget is that it was the United Kingdom, under both Margaret Thatcher and John Major, who enthusiastically pressed for Europe to be extended to the East after the fall of the Iron Curtain, for obvious strategic reasons. When Tories complain that there are too many Polish or Romanian immigrants, let them be gently reminded that it was Tory policy to support their membership. But in any case, why should we demonise Poles and Romanians who contribute to the Welsh economy? By all means, have regulations to prevent unscrupulous employers from undercutting local workers by employing immigrant labour at rock-bottom wages. But let's also ensure that our workers have the necessary skills and motivation to secure and to hold down such jobs. Mrs Thatcher signed the Single European Act in 1986, which gave the European Parliament a more influential role, and John Major steered the Maastricht Agreement through Parliament in 1993. The European Union today is as much the product of the United Kingdom as of anywhere else. It is a union that has been achieved largely by unanimity, and that unanimity included the United Kingdom. Britain has been in pole position to drive the change from a common market to a European Union. Now, this may be difficult to appreciate when one hears voices on the right insinuating that these changes were somehow neither wanted nor endorsed by Britain. Secondly, the Eurosceptics choose to ignore the significant beneficial changes in the way Europe is governed since the United Kingdom joined the common market in 1973. At that stage, there was no such thing as the European Parliament, a parliament in which Wales now has 4 elected members. Whether or not that provides adequate democratic answerability is quite another question. But in 1973, the Europe to which Britain signed up did things much more from the top down than is the case today. In earlier years, there was much talk about a federal Europe, and that generated fears of an over-centralised continent, although federal constitutions are actually the antithesis of centralised control. There was also a misunderstanding of terminology. The term federal was used by many when they meant confederal, the difference being that, of course, in a confederation, the constituent parts have the right to secede. And some, fearing the F word, warned in 1975 that if the UK voted yes, its membership of the EEC was irreversible. Now, that was always a nonsense, and the fact that UKIP can now talk of a referendum to leave the EU proves that point. In fact, the F word is hardly ever heard in the corridors of Brussels and Strasbourg nowadays. The scaremongers of a generation ago have been proven wrong. There was certainly a case made in the 1975 referendum that the EEC was too centralist, and that was an argument with which I had some sympathy. But in 1975, there was no such thing as the Committee of the Regions. That came into being after the Maastricht Treaty in 1994, and Europe was then given and Wales was then given 3 seats. An independent review 2 years ago showed the Committee of the Regions had influenced about 1/3 of EU legislation in a way that helped the regions. Many of us have supported a united Europe on the basis that the European principle of subsidiarity should always be uppermost. The enemies of that principle aren't the elected members of the European Parliament, but the centralist interests of Spain and France and Britain, who only want subsidiarity to work between Brussels and Madrid, Paris or London, but not between London and Cardiff, Madrid and Barcelona, Paris and Rennes. Another change is the mushrooming of small nations as full member states of the EU. The common market, which Britain joined in 1973, had just 9 member states. 3 were small: Denmark, Ireland and Luxembourg. Today, of the 28 countries in the European Union, no fewer than 16 have a population of under 10 million. Malta, Luxembourg, Cyprus, Estonia, Latvia, Slovenia, Lithuania, Croatia, Ireland, Slovakia, Finland, Denmark, Bulgaria, Austria, Sweden and Hungary. Well over half the members of the European Union are now small countries. And given the decision-making is either by unanimity or qualified majority voting, this clearly gives small countries a key role in influencing decisions. And those small member states also have a disproportionately large voice in the European Parliament compared to the larger states such as Britain, or indeed submerged nations like Wales and Scotland. Wales has just 4 MEPs. Malta, with 400,000 people, has 5. Luxembourg, with a population of Gwent, has 6, as do Cyprus and Estonia. Slovenia 7, Latvia 8, all smaller than Wales. We have a limited voice because we aren't recognised as a country in our own right, and we pay the price. And that's why, like Ireland and Denmark, we must be at the top table in our own right, as must Scotland. One change which caused the Conservatives to swing against the EU was Britain's adoption of the social chapter in 1997. A free-for-all market required social safeguards to avoid the exploitation of workers and communities from those profiting from an unbridled open market. Those safeguards included limitations on hours of work, safety in the workplace, gender equality, parental leave, human rights, the freedom of movement to find work, and non-discrimination against disabled people, the elderly and minorities. Safeguards have also been set to protect consumers, safety standards, price transparency, access to markets, and fair competition. Right-wing British politicians want these safeguards swept away. They see them as bureaucratic meddling by Brussels in decisions that should be taken at Westminster. And the irony is that if Britain withdrew from the EU, but still expected to sell goods to EU markets, we would have to comply with most of those regulations. As Norway has found after rejecting EU membership, Norway has had to adopt some 6,000 EU legislative acts since their referendum, regulations which their companies have to accept, but in whose formulation the Norwegian government had no voice at all. That would be the position facing British companies and the UK government if Britain pulled out of the EU. As the nature of the European Union changed, so did the attitude of Plaid Cymru. During the 1980s, Plaid Cymru found it had to adjust its political agenda to take on board three significant changes. Firstly, the referendum on Europe had settled the issue for a generation, and Wales was now part of the EEC. We might prefer to be there in our own right, but we were there as part of Britain for the foreseeable future. Secondly, we had experienced the trauma, and you all remember it, of the 1979 devolution referendum. Scotland then had voted yes, but London deemed that too few had voted yes. The severity of the 80% no in Wales set back severely our aspirations for Wales to be an EU member state in our own right. Thirdly, we were enduring the right-wing Tory regime of Mrs. Thatcher, who were starting to show their true Eurosceptic nature. The biggest change of all came in the 90s, when Wales, along with Scotland and Northern Ireland, had our right of national sovereignty recognised. It was the two Johns, John Smith and John Major, who took the bold step of accepting these national rights. The fact that Scotland, of its own choosing, is now holding an independence referendum whose outcome Westminster will recognise proves that point. I believe that having this right of independence ought to be sufficient a basis for us as a nation to claim membership of the EU. Our next referendum should be formulated in European terms, namely that Wales should be a member state of the European Union in our own right, and that would define the degree of independence we seek. But back to the 90s. When John Major took over, he was nothing like as hostile to Europe as was the Iron Lady, and it was under the Major government that the Maastricht Treaty came up for ratification. The treaty provided for European citizenship and new European powers over justice and home affairs, as well as a social chapter and monetary union, from which, of course, Major secured an opt-out. These provisions were broadly acceptable to Plaid Cymru, but Labour, frankly, played a cynical game in nominally supporting Maastricht, but doing everything in its power to prevent the Maastricht legislation from being approved. And with the Tory Eurosceptics in revolt, Major didn't have a majority to carry the Maastricht bill. I was his parliamentary pair at that time, and he knew that Plaid Cymru was sympathetic to Maastricht. This led to some fairly tough negotiations between us and the Tories, and to cut a long story short, we negotiated, in return for our support for the Maastricht Bill, a package which contained provision for Wales to have Interreg grants for joint projects with the Irish Republic, a provision that is still paying out, with £60 million spent on 41 projects over the last 6 years, and another 6-year tranche to be launched next month. We secured for Wales 3 seats on the EU Committee of the Regions, one for each of the 3 largest parties in Wales, giving Plaid Cymru our first foothold in European politics. Our package also included an all-Wales forum consisting of 4 MEPs, all MPs, and 1 representative from each of our local authorities to set up a body that could monitor European policy as it affected Wales. It met a couple of times, but got overtaken by the 1997 advent of the Assembly. At that time, the Western Mail commented like this, and I quote directly: "To the fury of Labour, Plaid Cymru has struck a rather handsome bargain. It offers Wales a significant step forward. Rarely has a minority party dealing with a government with a vulnerable majority, played a better or more productive hand. That's on the 10th of March, 1993. Welsh Labour MPs castigated us for having worked with the Tories. But frankly, I don't apologise for using our parliamentary position to secure benefits for Wales. We did likewise with the Labour government in 1979 when we secured half a dozen valuable provisions, including the Vital Pneumoconiosis Act. And the whole point of having Plaid Cymru MPs at Westminster is to get the best deal we can for Wales. That's what we did in 1993, and that's what our MEPs have done in Brussels and in Strasbourg. I can pay personal tribute to the way Jill has made critically important contributions to getting the best for Wales out of the European funding. In 2000, Wales had been included for the first time as being eligible for the highest level of structural funds, thanks to initiatives taken by Plaid Cymru in the 1990s and the key analytical work undertaken by the late Dr. Phil Williams, and thanks to also Plaid MPs at Westminster and the work of Jill Evans and Janet Davis, who I'm glad to see here tonight, on the EU Committee of the Regions. And to be fair, thanks to Ron Davies, who as Secretary for Wales was willing to work with us for the sake of Wales, which can't be said for every Welsh Secretary at Westminster. By 2001, Wales had a programme of Objective 1 funding approved by Brussels, which was contributing £180 million per annum for projects in West Wales and the valleys, including some here in Merthyr. I think the Technical College got £3 or £4 million at that time, if I remember. Largely thanks to the forensic work by Dr. Phil, who was by then a regional MEP for the South East, your region, Lindsay. We found, to my absolute dismay, that whereas Brussels were passing this money over to the Treasury in London, Gordon Brown and his cronies were pocketing the money, our money, into UK coffers without passing a brass farthing of additional cash over to the Assembly. Wales at the time had 5 MEPs, including Plaid's Jill Evans and Eirig Gwyn, after Plaid had secured 30% of the vote in the 1999 European elections, a target we should work to re-achieve. It was Jill Evans who set up a critical meeting for me with the European Commissioner for Regional Policy, Frenchman Michel Barnier, which was held on the 16th of March 2000 in the Commission office in Brussels and attended by SNP MEPs as well as Jill and Eirig. I described to Commissioner Barnier how the UK was pocketing the funds meant for Wales without passing any of it over to the National Assembly. Monsieur Barnier looked perplexed and turned to his civil servants and asked in French, and I knew enough to understand what he was asking, namely, can it be possible that such a claim is true? And they nodded their confirmation to him. And he turned back to Jill and myself and said that provided we didn't make an immediate political issue, he would take the matter up personally with the Treasury in Whitehall. We kept a low profile for the following weeks, and in July 2000, in his comprehensive spending review, Gordon Brown announced that Wales would be getting an extra £442 million. The point is this: without Jill and Eirig as Plaid MEPs, that meeting would not have taken place. That's why it's absolutely essential to have Jill Evans and indeed other Plaid MEPs in the European Parliament after this month's election, to ensure that the needs of Wales are put first and foremost on every occasion. Acts with Europe for the benefit of Wales. Remember, it was the UK government which refused to apply to Brussels to secure extra funding from the EU Solidarity Fund to cope with the flood crisis of recent months. It's an issue which our MPs have raised in the House of Commons and I've raised in the House of Lords, and I know Jill has raised over in the European Parliament. Isn't it typical that they found money, quite rightly, to restore the railway links to Cornwall, but the Cambrian Coast Railway line from Harlech to Pwllheli, vital for our tourism areas, is still closed? And while dealing with the problems faced by such rural areas in Wales, the UK government has repeatedly refused to put forward to Europe an application for any area of Wales to be exempted from fuel duty. This is a provision which the EU has facilitated for other areas. It's the UK government which refuses to use it for Wales, and then has the cheek to blame the EU for anything and everything that goes wrong. Having Plaid Cymru MEPs whose first loyalty to Wales is absolutely essential if we are going to get the best deal for Wales in such matters from the EU. There have been glaring examples over the last 5 years of other MEPs dancing to their party tune, contrary to the best interests of Wales. Take the European budget. Wales is a net beneficiary of this. Through the structural funds, the agricultural settlement and other programmes, we receive some £40 a head more in Wales than we pay into the European pot. It's vital for our economy that we retain such support. Yet Tory, Labour and UKIP MEPs voted to cut the budget. Wales's Labour MEP made a grand gesture of abstaining. Jill Evans was the only MEP from Wales to support that budget. That's why we need Plaid MEPs, ones who will always put the interests of Wales first. And likewise, Jill was the only Welsh MEP to vote to keep the agricultural direct payment scheme on which 80% of Welsh farmers rely. Jill has worked to give Wales a higher profile and a stronger voice in Europe. She has pressed to give the National Assembly the right to nominate a contender for the UK Commissioner post. She has helped to secure for the Welsh language a co-official status. Steered 2 new laws through Parliament, one on hazardous substances and another on pets passports. Secured a change in law regarding fallen agricultural stock. Campaigned successfully to ban insecticides which harm bees in Wales. Campaigned against the exclusion of Wales by the UK government from the European transport network, and helped create a European network for sustainable tourism. This year, Jill has been working to amend procurement rules to help small local businesses compete for publicly funded contracts and thereby retain such monies in the Welsh economy and create much-needed jobs. Wales is indebted to Jill for her sterling work, and we need her back in the European Parliament to fight for a better deal for Wales and a more efficient and democratic Europe. We in Wales need MEPs with a positive attitude towards Europe. Ones who will argue Wales's corner in terms of structural grants to rebalance our economy, argue the case of our farmers to have a stronger voice reflecting the particular needs of Welsh agriculture, and argue the case for subsidiarity, for environmental policies which respond to the challenges of climate change. A major problem facing Wales today is the refusal of the UK government to work with the grain of Europe. In regards to every item of policy, industrial, financial, environmental and agriculture, our own government in Cardiff has to go through the filter of Westminster before it can make representations to Europe, whether that is in relation to local government procurement, farming regulations, language status, environmental targets or corporate taxation policy to trigger economic development. In the Council of Ministers, the Westminster Minister is almost invariably the lead minister on behalf of the UK. And ministers from the devolved administrations in Wales, Scotland and Northern Ireland are required to speak to the UK official line. Once again, our problem is with London. What we need is for Wales to have its own direct voice in the European Union and not to be treated as a fringe province of a reluctant offshore island. And that comes to the core of Plaid Cymru's message. We stand for Wales having a full and effective voice in each and every forum in which the well-being of Wales can be influenced, incredibly including the House of Lords, as you kindly said, Lindsay. We don't agree with the minimal powers which were initially given to the Assembly, but we took our seats there, 17 compared to Labour's 28 in the first Assembly, and I see a number here today. Good to see Di Lloyd with us. 17 compared to Labour's 28, and argued our case to get the necessary powers, and we succeeded. We have criticised the Welsh Government policy, but we have not sulked on the sidelines. We have been prepared to participate in coalition government in positive and productive manners. And much credit must go to Plaid's Assembly Group during the coalition government, and particularly to Ian Wyn-Jones. We don't agree with Westminster's governments, particularly the right-wing governments, yes, Tory, but sometimes New Labour as well, which we've had over the past 30 years. Governments which successively have refused to square up to the bankers and failed to replace the outdated Barnett formula. But we go to Westminster to raise our voice for Wales, and to secure not only devolution of power and language rights, but also on social issues, disability legislation, pneumoconiosis acts, and last year's stalking law promoted so effectively by Elfyn Llwyd. We don't agree with the unelected second chamber, as I say, but as that chamber can block laws needed by Wales, I took my seat there in 2011, and it was the initiatives in that chamber that helped secure the independence of S4C. And that is what we want and need in Europe. We want Wales to have a full voice of our own in the structures of Europe. If Lithuania, with a population of Wales, can have 12 seats in the European Parliament, and if the only way for Wales to have the same number is for Europe to recognise Wales as a member state in our own right, then so be it. Let's have that full status, our own full team, playing for Wales in Brussels. If Ireland and even Luxembourg can have their own EU commissioner and can in turn chair the Council of Ministers, then why not Wales and Scotland? If Malta can veto certain EU treaty changes, why can't Wales? In practice, England, which dominates the UK position on such issues, has the veto, but nobody else. Why should Wales and Scotland be perennially relegated to the margins and not allowed to play our full and rightful role within a 21st century Europe? Why should we be held back by Westminster's failure to sustain a constructive relationship with our European partners? And that, my friends, brings me to the current hot potato of holding another referendum relating to the UK's membership of the EU. The point of holding a referendum is apparently in order to pull the countries of Britain out of the EU. So I understand why those who want to turn their backs on Europe should want such a vote. I don't want Wales or Britain to pull out of the EU. So frankly, I don't want a referendum. As I understand it, neither does Mr Cameron want Britain to quit the EU, nor Mr Miliband, nor Mr Clegg. So why on earth are we contemplating such a disastrous course of action, which could destabilise industry, destroy structures needed to deal with climate change, and sidetrack efforts to get our economy moving? Why are we dancing to UKIP's tune, a party that hasn't won a single House of Commons seat? People might well say, if they have a referendum in Scotland on independence, why not on the EU? The difference is this. The right of Scotland's government to hold a referendum is based on the SNP having won a majority of seats in the Scottish Parliament on a manifesto committing to such a referendum. If UKIP won a majority of seats at Westminster, of course they'd have a right to a UK-wide referendum on UK's membership of the EU. But so far, that is something they've dismally failed to do, despite Mr Farage using European funds to sustain his own party. I shudder at the thought of Mr Farage in Downing Street with his finger on Britain's nuclear trigger. Mr Farage and his racist cronies in France, Italy and Greece, if they win a majority of seats this month, they might have a mandate for a referendum throughout Europe on the future of the Union. But to my mind, UKIP and their single-issue agenda have had far too much attention. Unless they win seats at Westminster or in our National Assembly, they just cannot be taken as more than a protest vote, probably as much against politicians in Westminster as against Europe. Well, of one thing I'm certain, every UKIP voter doesn't believe in the UK pulling out of Europe unconditionally, whatever the consequences for jobs and our standard of living. UKIP have to prove themselves in a much more rigorous political arena than the European parliamentary elections if they want to establish their right to have a referendum on pulling the UK out of Europe. They have to argue detailed policy, not glib headline slogans. What is more, a leaflet distributed by post by UKIP in Wales last week, a leaflet, incidentally, printed in England for the whole of Wales, so much for UKIP's professed support for Welsh business. This leaflet asked voters to put it in their window, showing a slogan, "No more leaflets, thank you." That speaks volumes, doesn't it, for their democratic credentials. UKIP is a single policy party whose answer to every question is to press the self-destruct button on European unity. And unless Welsh voters are totally convinced in their own minds, convinced beyond any shadow of doubt that they want to destroy the structures that have helped ensure peace between EU partners for most of our lifetimes, they should think twice before channeling their political frustrations into such a nihilistic course of action. There may be understandable frustration with the way in which UK governments fail to generate economic growth, with Wales's government not sorting out our NHS, and even Merthyr's council some of their planning decisions. But we wouldn't choose to demolish those democratic institutions because of policy shortcomings. So why on earth should we sweep away the body which ensures fair trading practice between countries, which creates structures which minimize the likelihood of war within our continent, and which coordinates the essential transnational battle to control climate change? That is what UKIP would have the people of Wales do in this election, and I can only plead with every conviction in my body for Welsh electors to think twice and to shun such a disastrous course of action. So, my friends, where does all this leave Wales? What has been the experience of Wales in relation to Europe over the past 40 years? There are many pluses and some minuses. In economic terms, the rundown of coal and steel would have happened irrespective of our membership of the EU. We predicted this in our economic plan in 1970. What Wales secured, largely through the work of the WDA, was an injection of foreign direct investment into our manufacturing sector, particularly from America and Japan. There are now some 50 companies from Japan employing over 6,000 people in Wales today. And over 300 companies from America have invested in Wales, employing well over 20,000 people. These companies came because they saw the UK as a base from which to trade with Europe. Had we not been in the EU, many of them wouldn't have come to Wales. And the most important thing for business and industry is its market. Without a market for its produce, everything will fail. And one of the most important characteristics of a market is its stability. We are told that the Welsh economy has started recovering from catastrophic banker-led depression during the last Labour government's term of office. But the recovery is very fragile. And one of the biggest threats to this is the threat of withdrawal from the European market. Investors looking, particularly from the US, see the UK in general, including Wales, along with Ireland, as attractive locations from which to enter the European market, not least because of the English language. It would be extremely foolish to put all of this at risk. Businesses will think twice about locating in Wales, and indeed in the UK, if there is a possibility that in a few years' time their access to the European market could be removed. They are looking to invest in a country where there is stability, where they can plan for the long term, and where they can have confidence that their investment will have a guaranteed access to an integral part of the European market. We may have put too much emphasis on attracting overseas investors at the expense of growing our own indigenous industry. Some might argue that European competition rules prevent new businesses from having a greenhouse protection. I don't believe this is true. Plaid Cymru's regime in Gwynedd Council pioneered the use of EU structural funds to help small businesses get established and grow. Now, Ireland has shown over the past 40 years, by working with the grain of Europe and with their own voice at the top table, they have been able to achieve economic success. You know, when I started taking an interest in these things in 1956, Ireland's GDP was exactly half that of Wales. By now, it is 2.5 times ours. Despite recent difficult years, by 2011, the GDP per capita of Ireland was 29% above the EU average, while that of Wales was 26% below. An independent Scotland within the EU will undoubtedly achieve similar success, and Wales must learn the lesson. Continuing membership of the EU provides the confidence needed by business to live with constitutional change in the wake of Scotland's independence referendum. The UK government and the EU owe it to overseas investors in Britain to remove uncertainties about our future in Europe. If Britain is a full part of the European Union, and if Scotland, England and Wales, as independent countries, want to remain part of the EU, as I hope they would, then an acceptable process of transition must be established by Brussels and the governments of our three nations. Europe must develop a mechanism to accept as a new member state a territory which was previously part of an existing member state, but wishes to be a country in its own right. The veto of a single country can't be allowed to deny the democratic wishes of another. Otherwise, we shall hand to paranoid imperialists in Madrid a right to veto each and every aspiring self-governing country. I'm going to Barcelona later this month at the invitation of the Catalan government, and I shall convey to them a simple message that if Madrid or any other member state chooses to veto Scotland joining the EU with a seamless transition, then let us make it an objective of any renegotiation of the Constitution of Europe that we take away such inherently undemocratic vetoes and make such decisions on a qualified majority vote. And if Mr. Cameron is a statesman and a Democrat, he should now be giving the Scottish people an assurance that he would support such a change. But let's consider the other scenario, that UKIP gets its way and a referendum shows that England wants to pull out of the European Union, while Wales and Scotland want to remain members. If England is outside the European Union, Scotland would have a choice of either also being outside the EU and maintaining a common market with England, or being in the EU with all the implications that would have. Incidentally, in the coming European election, if UKIP votes strongly in England, it'll cement in Scottish minds the likelihood of an early pull-out, in-out referendum, and may well drive Scottish voters to conclude that the only way to secure Scotland's place in Europe is a yes vote for independence. It is indeed ironic, therefore, that a vote for UKIP this month could boost the likelihood of Scotland leaving the UK. But if it comes to Wales, we have to be realistic. If England is outside the EU and Wales wants to remain or become a member of the Union in our own right, then serious implications arise. And that, to my mind, is neither desirable nor politically viable. That leaves Plaid Cymru with the difficult position of accepting that if England votes in an early referendum to pull out of the EU, then Wales would also face leaving the EU. And to my mind, that would be an absolute disaster. We need to be part of an international structure that is greater than Wales, greater than Britain, one which permits us to enjoy the benefits of full self-government while also having a voice in a wider union that controls those matters which are beyond the ability of any one country to control. If we have an in-out referendum on Britain's membership of the EU prior to Wales becoming an independent country, Plaid Cymru should certainly support a vote to stay in Europe. So if Mr. Cameron is re-elected next May, and succeeds in renegotiating aspects of the European treaties, probably relating to trade, he might possibly dress it up enough to advocate a yes vote. And moving some powers from Brussels to Cardiff might be something that Plaid would welcome, and we should press this on the Conservatives if they return to power. If, however, the Tories were to refute European powers on human rights or environmental matters, it would be very hard indeed for Plaid to accept such changes. Nonetheless, if we want Britain to remain as part of a European Union, we would have to put on a brave face, hold our noses and support a yes vote. The alternative, no vote, a vote for quitting the EU, would be even worse and would undermine Plaid Cymru's constitutional aspirations. Ed Miliband has indicated that if Labour wins the next election, they wouldn't hold an in-out vote. They would only hold a referendum if there were proposed changes to the European Treaty, which they would have to ratify in any case. However, there's no guarantee that Labour won't be bullied by the London press into changing their mind. And if Ed Miliband wins next year's election and has been cornered into promising a referendum, he would probably have it very quickly, as the referenda are most easily won by governments still in the afterglow of election success, as happened with our referendum in Wales in 1997. In practice, such a snap referendum would have to be a yes-no on current terms of membership. There wouldn't have been time to renegotiate new terms. There are circumstances that warrant our consideration. Firstly, what would be the position if Scotland votes yes this September? The actual Independence Day wouldn't be until March 2016. So if Ed Miliband were to hold a snap referendum, say in September 2015, it would be a referendum for a United Kingdom which within 12 months would have materially changed in its composition. If the resulting vote in the UK was yes overall, the path would be clear for Scotland as an independent country to negotiate their own terms of membership with the EU, aiming for a smooth transition from being part of the UK to being an independent country with continuity of membership of the EU and with open borders with England. The difficulties arise in two circumstances. If the UK votes yes by a narrow margin, but that margin has been delivered by Scottish voters. It's inconceivable that England would accept an outcome driven by a Scotland which had already voted to leave the United Kingdom. Secondly, and this could be a difficulty at whatever date a EU referendum is held, what would happen if Britain voted to leave the European Union, but Wales and Scotland voted to remain within the EU? Even if Scotland had voted no to independence this September, a no to Europe driven by English votes would certainly reopen that question. If there were a second independence referendum in Scotland, the Scots could easily think again and vote yes to independence in order to remain as part of the European Union. And this would cause, obviously, a difficult situation for Wales. Quite clearly, if Wales had to have voted to remain part of the EU, then Wales has a right to do so. And that would have to be as a nation in our own right. But if England insists on having full frontier controls with all EU countries, that would cause unnecessary impediments. That's why I'm totally convinced that our overriding national priority must be to secure a UK yes vote to remain in the EU. That is needed in our own economic self-interest and to facilitate our ultimate objective of Wales as a member state of the European Union in our own right. No one can say that we don't live in interesting times. Until this issue is resolved, I see my contribution to Welsh politics over the next few years, God willing, as doing everything in my power to ensure that Wales remains in the European Union. And until we get independence, that means ensuring that Britain remains in the EU. I believe that this should be the united objective of Plaid Cymru, for I can't see any circumstances in which Plaid Cymru would advocate quitting Europe. And because of the overarching importance for Wales and for fulfilling Plaid Cymru's vision for Wales of the UK remaining part of Europe, I have taken the initiative to link up with governments of small European states to find out how they see the membership of the EU helping them and their people. And I started with a meeting of ambassadors in London and shall be following up with visits to these countries over coming months. I had my first meeting last Friday in Luxembourg. I heard how they had often filled key roles in the EU, have chaired the EU Commission for 2 4-year periods, have chaired other significant committees, giving them the ability to know from the inside how things are developing, to influence courses of action, and to help steer things in a way that helps Luxembourg. I was told how the larger states are often willing to give the chair of such bodies to smaller countries, as that is an easier compromise when large rival states may be vying for power, which comes from such a chair. I also learned how Luxembourg used their veto to defend important economic factors relevant to their country. And most small countries haven't used their veto, but as any good chess player will know, the threat can be more dangerous than the execution. The most important comment which I heard last week, and very apposite for tonight's theme, were those from a former Luxembourg MEP who said that the continued existence of Luxembourg as a self-governing country is, and I quote, a miracle. And he summed it up in these words: "The EU is the only framework that could have allowed Luxembourg to remain a sovereign state." I couldn't have put it better. Plaid Cymru is the only party standing up for Wales in these terms. We want to engage with Europe, and we refuse to throw the toys out of the pram when we don't get our own way with Brussels. We fight and fight again for Wales to get the needs answered. We won our argument with EU Interreg funding. We won the long argument for EU structural funds. We won, thanks to Jill, we won EU recognition for the Welsh language, and provided that we have a strong Plaid Cymru voice in the European Parliament, following this month's election, we shall continue to win for Wales. We offer the electorate a unique profile. We are the only party in this election whose loyalty is first and foremost to the people of Wales. We are the only party which aspires for Wales as a nation to play its own part in Europe in our own right. Unlike UKIP, we don't throw overboard all the gains we have had over the past half-century in terms of establishing a basis for peaceful cooperation between the peoples of Europe, of avoiding ever again tearing our continent apart in bloody wars. And unlike the Tories, we don't refuse to accept the social provisions of European legislation, geared to safeguarding the place of work rights of working people and the human rights of everyone, whatever their language, colour or creed. And unlike Labour, I regret to say, our voices in Europe won't be controlled by party bosses in London. Plaid Cymru representatives are proud to work together with those from other small nations on our continent to build a decentralist, democratic Europe of 100 flags, rich in its diversity, as described by Saunders Lewis back in 1926. We will work to enable every decision that can be taken in Wales to be taken here by our own elected people, but also for Wales to have its own full voice in the chambers of Brussels, to contribute to debates on those issues, environmental and economic, which can't be decided individually by a single nation. Plaid Cymru, my friends, is the authentic voice of Wales in Europe. Please give us the support needed on the 22nd of May to give that voice the platform it deserves, to help secure for our nation the opportunity for which it craves and the future it deserves. Diolch yn fawr.